At the end of the last movie about array functions, we alluded to something called booleans, and specifically when we were looking at the function called inArray, we said that it returned a boolean and that a boolean was true or false. In this movie, we're going to explain booleans a little bit further because they're going to become very valuable tools for us later on. Let's start by creating ourselves a new workspace. Once again, we'll save as this page, and I'm going to call this page booleans, booleans. That's how you spell it. It's booleans. And I'm going to save it in my PHP sandbox. And I'm going to change the title here to be booleans, booleans, and null, which is the other thing we're going to explore while we're here. And let's go ahead and clear all of those out. Now, a boolean is simply true or false. So let's set a variable equal to true. Let's say bool1 equals true. Now notice we didn't put any quotes around it because we're not talking about the string, the word true. We're talking about actual true, that something is or isn't true. It's a logical operator, not the word true, but the actual truth of the matter. And we can do the same thing with bool2 and make it equal to false. So that's a boolean that has been assigned to a variable. Now, true and false are case insensitive. You could actually type them all in capitals. You could put a capital T or a capital F, whatever suits you. But the overall idea here that we're trying to get at is that there is something called true and something called false that's separate from those words. Now, booleans are really going to come into play when we start talking about logical operators later, when we want to test, is something true? And if it's true, then do something else. Without using in such a test, it's difficult to output the concept of true to our browser. But we can try. Let's go ahead and say PHP echo boolean1. Bool1, there we go. And let's go ahead and put our BR tag at the end. And then we'll do the same thing for boolean2, just so that we can have a comparison. And I'll save both of those. There we go. And I'll go back to my browser, and we'll now load up our new page, which is going to be booleans. And you'll see that it came back with 1, and that's it. Now, it's not very clear which one is 1, so let's go ahead and make this a little clearer and say bool1, and actually put a $sign in front of it, just so that we're very clear that we're talking about the string. There we go. That should be easy to read. Let's switch back and look again. Now we'll see that boolean1, which was true, gave us a value of 1, while boolean2, which was not true or false, came back as nothing. And that's the way that it's going to represent it when we echo these values out. Basically, echo's doing its best to come up with what is the concept of true and false, and how can I show that on the screen, and this is what it comes up with. Now, we're not going to be echoing that in most cases. If we wanted to output a certain word like true, we could test for it and then echo the word that corresponds. One area where we can apply this that we've already visited is with variables, and we can actually test whether or not variables have been set or not. Let's go ahead and create ourselves a new PHP area to work in down here. And let's go ahead and assign a couple of variables. Let's say that variable 1 is going to be equal to the number 3, and variable 2 is going to be equal to cat. That should be good enough to work with. Now, if we ask whether or not a value is set or not, let's say variable 1 is set, is what we're going to test. And we're going to echo back the PHP for is set variable 1. Now, is set is a function that allows us to determine the Boolean state of is variable 1 set or not, and it will return either true or false. And let's go ahead and put a BR tag at the end of that, and we'll copy that whole line, and we'll ask the same thing about variable 2. Now, while we're here, let's go ahead and add a third one, and let's ask about variable 3. Now, we haven't had a reference to variable 3 yet. Let's load it up in the browser and see what we get. Variable 1 is set. True. Variable 2 is set. True. Variable 3 is set. False. It wasn't set. So that's a great way for us to be able to test whether or not a variable has been set or not. We can also use another variable command, which we didn't visit earlier, which is unset. Let's say that we say php unset the variable 1. And then let's just duplicate all 3 of those lines again and paste them down here. And now that we've unset the variable, let's see what it gives us. Now you'll see that only variable 2 has been set. Variable 1 has been basically erased. Variable 1, we can say, has been set to null. Now, null is the other concept that I want to visit with you. Null is equivalent to nothing. Null and false also have some amount of equivalency, and we can often refer to them as being the same thing. And in fact, if we ask it to display the value of 1, it will respond with nothing, the same way that it responded with nothing for false. Most times, if you're dealing with a logical expression, if something is true or false, you're going to want to deal with booleans, true or false. Null is going to be its own thing. It's just a void, it's nothing, it's unset. And we can actually test for null by testing for whether something is empty or not. If it's empty, it will return back false. So let's try this. With variable 1, let's ask if it's empty. PHP echo empty variable 1. Oops, I forgot my semicolon there. Let me just add that. And let me go ahead and put a BR tag at the end. So now the question is variable 1 empty? Is it null? And we come back, and the answer is true. It is null. So even though it responded with true, it was doing a test for us for whether or not this was equal to nothing. Now, there's one thing you need to be careful with about empty, and that's that empty will respond not only to false and null as being values which are empty, but it will also go ahead and try and interpret a few other types. Let me go ahead up here and create something called variable 4, and I'm going to give it a value of 0. And then down here, I'll ask whether or not variable 4 is going to be empty. And empty is actually going to say yes, 0. That qualifies as empty, so it returned true to me. The same thing will happen if we go ahead and tell it that it's actually a string equal to 0. So it's actually the number 0 as a bit of text. And if we come back, it'll say, yes, that's also empty. So you'll want to read up on the documentation before you start relying on empty too much. But empty is basically going to say, is this item null or somewhat equivalent to null? And we can always just set values equal to null as well. And usually you'll see it all in capitals, but it's also case insensitive. So you'll see there I have variable 4 now set to be equal to null, and we can test it one last time and see that it is still true. So that's a quick overview of how Booleans work. They're a very simple type, and we'll visit them a lot more in depth when we start talking about logical expressions. Now we've visited most of the major types that we're going to be working with. Let's talk about type switching. That's the way in which empty went ahead and switched types between the quote 0 quote and made it into something that was equivalent to null. That's the kind of type switching that we're talking about, and we'll explore it in more depth in the next movie.